circumstance in particular.
I was just going to say that sometimes when, you know, and Tony, you mentioned this, that people always go sort of to the same places, but when we start talking about community, I think that oftentimes we really have to be mindful about how we are defining that and who that really means, for example, because if the population that I'm working with are lower SES black men who happen to have sex with other men, that might be a specific community that's very different, say, than middle class, Ph.D. Folks who may have some similar sexual risk, but the construct that their lives operate in, it can be very, very different. And so I think that one of the things that we often do is we sort of describe black men, particularly black men who have sex with other men, regardless of how you call yourself. We kind of describe us as though we're one monolithic group. Like, this is what we need to do for black men, for black men's sexuality. When there's more diversity within us, even just in this room, than there is outside of that. So I think that we tend to sell ourselves short with regard to that. The whole intervention in a box thing, it's not working.
Okay, what about issues of power? What do y'all think about issues of power? So if you're thinking about some of the issues that might need to kind of get worked within the context of communities, folks doing community-based participatory research. So I'm thinking about power dynamics between researchers and folks in the community. Wait, let me just, this is y'all chance to really kind of go in, you know, and just kind of like, okay, so I want to turn it up a little bit.
I think there's it's a given that there's a power dynamic between the person who can bring the money to the table because they have the research connections, and then the community-based organization comprised of mostly people who are earning about, you know, a third or a quarter of the dollars that the researchers are earning. And then when you put together a budget, as I often do, and you see, well, wait, we only have 10% of this person, but oh my gosh, they're so expensive. And then the people at the bottom who are 100% allocated to this are actually, in terms of dollars, not worth as much to the project. So I think that power dynamic is inherent. But I also don't think it's going to change anytime soon, because I think that for whatever, well, structurally, we want to give a lot of money, or we'll give money if we say there's proof that it's going to work, and that's why it's going to stay in research. And the other thing I wanted to bring up in terms of tension, I think, are something that I've noticed for a long time is sort of the popularity of the pilot project. Let's do this pilot project where we get people involved and we have a really rigorous intervention that's highly funded, and it's proven successful, and then many, many times it sits on the shelf. It doesn't. It's been proven. It also, in terms of dollars, could never be replicated in terms of dollars for the, you know, number of people who got the intervention. But I think that's about the power. The money is going to go to the researchers, the Ph.D.s, you know, many of whom are in this room and I love, and it'll eventually trickle down to do the work. But that's just the way the system is right now.
Dr. Wilton, we'd like to also open it up to the audience. If people have comments, please.
Okay. Mr. Lindsay.
I just have a question, and to be completely honest, I'm not sure if I'm fully understanding if my question is like on the same lines as where you guys are, but so I work for an agency here in LA. Now, granted, we don't primarily work with the MSM population. We do overall prevention work, including HIV and AIDS and STDs, alcohol, drugs, all that. But my executive director and myself, I'm the program manager for the prevention department, have been dancing around, possibly looking at some research things that we've seen, like grants that we've seen. But we're not even sure if it's something we can do. So I'm like, where I'm coming from is I'm reading this and seeing what you're talking about, and I'm like, oh, we can do that? Because we have talked about it and we would love to do that, but we don't know, like, do we need to go hire a PhD? Like, I just graduated with my master's, and I'm like fell in love with the whole research process when I was writing my thesis, and I'm like, is this something I can dive into? Like, so I'm wondering, is it something we can do as a small community-based organization? Like, what's the...
Yeah, absolutely. But you don't have to hire the Ph.D. You just need to latch onto them and have them see that it's in their interest too, because they'll get funded. You have to find somebody who has research interests that that jibe with what you want to do.
And if at all possible, you should either yourself or some of the folks that you're working with should be in some way connected to the population that you're interested in studying.
I started a side conversation that we were talking about, but I don't remember your name, but all the way in the end, he mentioned something that, Christopher, thank you. I work for UCLA, and I actually am a community liaison over there, specifically in AIDS research, so obviously this is very relevant for me. Having also been at Charles Drew, and I'm kind of troubled by something that's always bothered me in people's inability to include other unconventional definitions of community. Specifically, I was mentioning to him the whole problem of socioeconomic status that is an extremely unifying factor, and particularly when we look in the diversity and demographics of Southern California, how much it differentiates how people define themselves. And I know me being in the field, people are very alienated more by how you perceive their status sometimes than how you perceive their race. And a lot of people don't want to deal with that because we haven't even correctly dealt with the problem of race. So to then get into the idea of status, which is also very tied, but not synonymous. And people are very insulted, and I think rightly so, to think that they are necessarily the same. That's an issue. We were talking about the differences of how ID use. I think something that's very interesting, it's like 14% on the East Coast with white women, but those white women share a social economic status that is equivalent to many of the MSM men, but nobody looks at that. And I think when people are looking at community, the idea of community is so constricted to what we can see at a distance that we miss so many of the ways that we could actually reach out to our community. For instance, if I go into a community of people under these assumptions, and people do this, they do it all the time. I know because I have colleagues that I watch do it. I'm sure I've made the mistake of doing it, and assuming that because you are a certain culture, your disenfranchisement is equivalent to the person next to you who's also that same color. Not only does it disservice, but it alienates people who might otherwise participate with you.
I couldn't agree more, honestly.
So I just wanted to know, have you all, especially, I know we were talking about this in writing a grants, how you would address that. I mean, I'm not at that level yet, but once I get there within the next few years, that's certainly something I want to address, because with those of us who now have to spend the grant money, as you know, with restrictions, there issues abound around that you don't anticipate, because you're thinking, oh, the black community is all one community, and they all live in this one place, and they all ride the same bus, and it's just ridiculous. I mean, obviously I'm exaggerating, but the problem is within these grants, sometimes it's that ridiculous. The assumptions are really that ridiculous. But you look at my population, I'm a black woman, 68% of people who finish graduate degrees within the black community are female. Think about the disparities in education that creates within the quote-unquote same community. I just want to know how, in writing grants, we can look to address that in the future.
Maybe it's in writing the RFPs and RFAs, which is way over our heads. Because, you know, when you're writing for money is reactive. You're being told, do this, 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 and this. I mean, in some cases, you get to sub-define your community. And my organization ends up writing for a lot of HIV money, and we say, and we're serving incarcerated or post-incarcerated folks. And that's a subgroup that we're creating. And it actually ends up, you know, really hitting a lot of the high-risk factors. But I think your point is fantastic, but we're dealing with the boxes that are put out there, I think, in general, by the people who are writing the RFAs and RFPs.
I appreciate your comments, but something that was said to me a long time ago when I was at a conference, an HIV prevention conference, and they were talking about Latino MSM and masculinity and machismo, and I kept looking at the presenter and I said, well, have you done this with black men, because these are some similar construct? And he pointed at me, he said, no, I'm focused on Latino men. Why don't you do the research? And so I did. And so what I'm saying to you is it's not bound by the RFAs or the PAs. There's actually exploratory grants you can write. There are 21s. There are other kind of institutional grants that you can write. So if you're noticing this, why are you asking the panel? The answer is in you. So, no. You know, because what I'm saying is that a lot of times when we sit on these panels, the panel's not going to give us the answer. So your comment is well taken, but I would, if I was on the panel, I'd put it right back on you. I'd say, well, what are you going to do about it? Because you've noticed all this stuff. So you writing the grant right now? Oh.
Yeah.
I'm with it. That's.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm gonna give you my card later, because I don't BS about this, because I'm very clear that if you notice this dynamic in what you're doing, and we call this in the field, then go ahead and do it. If you don't see anybody else doing it, the answer's in you. Look in the mirror and then say, okay, and then reach out to people. That's what part of this is. That's why John had this. Where's John? Where did he go?
He's right there.
Oh, my bad. John, that's why John had this, so like we can network, because you're going to see a lot of people in different positions, and we can exchange information. So when you have that idea, you can network, so it's a little bit easier for you to navigate that stuff, ask the right questions, write the grant, and so on and so forth.
You are totally right. I'm really glad you said that, because, yeah, I mean, the community-based participatory research, the community-based people can't go right for the RO1s. So you go. And I'm going to have to excuse myself because my flight is in not too long. I'm going back up to the Bay Area where I'm actually from, but thank you all.
Thank you for the discussion. The sister here made one of the points I wanted to make, which she probably made better than I could have. And I do agree with you, David, with many of your points, although I think part of what you were trying to say was that there's ways in which minority communities, or we might uphold a monolithic view of community for our own agenda that can sometimes be problematic. And I guess I had another related comment on those same lines. I think in general, whenever people start throwing the community word around a little too loosely, I'm always like, okay, which community are we talking about? I'm struck sometimes in LA. I feel like a lot of the people who I have a great deal of admiration and respect for, who have done work on behalf of the black community, but when I hear them, it seems sometimes like they're talking about a historical black community that does not exist anymore in the way that it once did. And so that it's not concentrated between these certain blocks and addresses, and it defines it itself in a much more complex and diverse ways. And so we need to, keep that in mind. Mm-hmm. And for example, there was a statement made earlier today that I actually wish he was here so I could say to him directly about people receiving services in West Hollywood. And if you go to West Hollywood on a Saturday night, you actually will see a lot of African Americans. And so even though there are many people who would not step foot, many people in the black LGBT community who don't want to step foot in West Hollywood, there are plenty who do. And so keeping in mind that diversity is also important and a hard thing for us, I think, sometimes. And finally, related to that, I would say that the other diversity that I don't hear talked about enough is the ethnic diversity within black communities. And so somebody talked about Gene Robinson's work and the work of like immigrant black community, not the work of the immigrant black communities that exist. And in many places, those communities still aren't addressed within HIV programming. And I think LA is kind of a glaring example of a place where there's really not targeted messages or outreach or programs or organizations that are addressing Caribbean, West Indian, African, more recently descended communities within the black community.